Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping right into, well, an absolutely mind-boggling moment in economic history.
We are. We're talking about the German hyperinflation, early 1920s.
Yeah, 1920 to 1923, roughly. And the speed of this currency collapse, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around it.
It really is. I mean, prices weren't just rising, they were accelerating at a rate that was just astronomical, doubling in days, sometimes even hours near the end.
Faster than clerks could even post the new prices. Faster than printing presses could churn out the worthless cash.
Exactly. People talk about inflation maybe 5%, 10% a year. This was something else entirely. We ended up with numbers like quintillions of marks.
Quintillions. But those huge numbers, they represented almost no real value compared to, say, 1913 levels.
Precisely. And that's why we're doing this deep dive. It's not just some historical curiosity, is it?
No, absolutely not. This period, it really gives us the hard evidence we need to push back against a really dangerous myth.
Which myth is that?
The idea that, just printing money can somehow magically stimulate a real lasting economic recovery for a nation.
Ah, yes. The perpetual motion machine of economics. It's a persistent one.
It is. So our mission today is to dismantle that illusion. And our guide.
Our guide is Frank D. Graham's fantastic study, Exchange Prices and Production in Hyperinflation, published back in 1930.
A classic and incredibly rigorous, empirically grounded.
Absolutely. Graham gives us the cold, hard accounting needed to measure the true cost of inflation.
And it's not just about the money, right? He looks beyond the material wreckage.
Oh, yes. He connects it to the moral and social decay, which is profound.
What made Graham's approach so effective?
Well, he didn't just count the banknotes, which were exploding in volume, obviously. He meticulously tracked what was happening in the real economy.
You mean things like actual production?
Exactly. Industrial output, employment figures, how domestic prices were actually being set.
And that super complicated relationship between internal prices and the foreign exchange rate, especially as the mark was just plummeting.
Right, as it went into total free fall. We're going to see how all this intense activity, this seeming boom, was what Graham called a counterfeit prosperity. Activity without real productivity.
Okay, let's set the scene. Germany, just after World War I, defeated, politically unstable.
And saddled with enormous liabilities, the big one being the Treaty of Versailles.
Right, Versailles laid down these demands that Graham calls fixed, ineluctable demands, unavoidable.
And that's the absolute key starting point, reparations. It wasn't just the amount, though that was huge. It was the structure of the payment. They were fixed in foreign exchange, dollar, pounds, francs. The German government had to get its hands on these fixed amounts of foreign currency at regular intervals.
Okay, I see. So not just pay a certain amount of marks, but find actual dollars or pounds.
Precisely. And that immediately sets up this vicious financial circle.
Ah, yeah, the feedback loop. Let's trace that.
Okay, so the mark starts to depreciate, maybe just a little at first. But because those reparations are fixed in dollars, the cost in marks to buy those dollars suddenly shoots up.
Making the government's budget problem way worse instantly.
Way worse. And the government didn't really have great ways to quickly raise taxes or borrow from the public market, so where did they turn?
Straight to the Reichsbank, the central bank.
Yep, for loans, accommodation, and the inevitable rust. An enlarged note issue. They printed more marks.
Which then causes the mark to depreciate further.
Exactly. Which then makes the next reparations payment even more expensive in marks. And round it goes. Rational fiscal planning. It sounds like a trap baked into the post-war settlement itself.
It really was. Graham emphasizes this. He argues this external pressure was the key difference for Germany. He says stabilization was, and I'm quoting loosely here, in large part due to pressure from outside and kind of beyond her own control as long as those reparation demands felt insatiable. So unlike other countries with big war debts, Germany had this unique problem of needing fixed foreign cash it often just didn't have.
Yes, it created an impossible situation at times.
But Graham doesn't just blame the Allies, does he? The sources suggest Germany wasn't entirely a victim of circumstance.
No. He absolutely doesn't let domestic policy off the hook. That's the crucial nuance. He says inflation was, quote, nurtured rather than repressed inside Germany.
Nurtured? That sounds almost deliberate.
Well, maybe not fully deliberate everywhere, but certainly enabled. You had powerful business groups, big industrialists, landowners.
What was their role?
They were either apathetic about stopping inflation, some actually benefited hugely from it, or they actively resisted the kind of vigorous taxation that could have stabilized things.
Why would they benefit?
Inflation destroys debt. If you owe a lot of marks and the mark becomes worthless, your debt vanishes in real terms. They also didn't want higher taxes cutting into their operations.
So they didn't cooperate much with the government's attempts to meet its obligations.
Only half-heartedly, as Graham puts it. The political will to impose the necessary fiscal discipline, to establish a stable currency, it just wasn't there. Not until the absolute final collapse.
It sounds like a failure of political will, maybe even political character, driven by powerful interests.
You could definitely argue that. Printing money was just politically easier than imposing tough taxes on powerful groups, especially when you also needed money for internal subsidies and reconstruction.
And this whole mess comes to a head in early 1923.
Yes, with the invasion of the Ruhr industrial region by French and Belgian troops. They were frustrated by Germany's lagging reparation payments.
How did Graham see that invasion?
It's interesting. He condemned the act itself, naturally, but he also called it the thunderclap that cleared the air.
Cleared the air? How?
Well, for the Allies, it demonstrated the limits of force. They didn't get much out of it. And for the Germans, the economic chaos that followed was so severe.
What happened?
Massive disruption. The German government told workers not to cooperate, called for passive resistance. Strikes shut down the industrial heartland.
Okay, so production stops.
Right. But the government promised to support the striking workers financially. How? By printing even more money and handing out credits like crazy.
Oh, wow. So you have production collapsing in the Ruhr, the engine of the economy.
While the government is simultaneously flooding that same region and the country with newly printed marks to fund the resistance.
It sounds like pouring gasoline on the fire.
It was the final catastrophic accelerant. You had the underlying reparations pressure, the shock of the invasion itself, and now this internal policy of funding resistance with the printing press.
And the sources mention real hardship in the Ruhr. Expulsions, confiscations.
Yes, severe dislocation. It convinced even the hardliners in Germany that maybe accepting some kind of moderated burden on reparations was necessary just for national survival. But the immediate impact on the currency was devastating. It pushed the mark over the edge into hyperinflation proper.
Okay, so the currency is in free fall, the political situation is chaotic. Which brings us to this really bizarre paradox that Graham highlights.
The illusion of the boom. Yeah, it's fascinating and deeply disturbing.
Because while the mark was dying, a lot of the economic statistics looked good, even great.
Shockingly good in some ways. Graham documents this with meticulous data. Let's start with unemployment.
What happened with jobs?
From mid-1921 right up until that Ruhr invasion in early 23, unemployment steadily fell.
Fell during accelerating inflation.
Yes. By the autumn of 1922, it was practically gone. Graham notes only about 10,000 to 15,000 persons in the whole Reich were getting unemployment relief.
10 to 15,000 in the whole of Germany. That's nothing.
Pretty much full employment. He even says it was a situation better than it had ever been since the beginning of industrialization. Compare that to the US at the time.
Right. They were in a post-war slump, weren't they? High unemployment.
Exactly. They were struggling with deflation and recession. Germany, meanwhile, looked like it had solved the unemployment problem seemingly by printing money.
And this wasn't just people digging ditches, right? Industrial activity picked up too.
Absolutely. Germany didn't just avoid that post-1920 global slump that hit the US, UK, France. Its industrial output increased.
Increased by how much?
By a huge 23% in 1921, and then another 12% on top of that in 1922.
Wow. So on paper, it looks like inflation is this amazing stimulant. Jobs are plentiful. Factories are humming.
It seemed like a miracle cure. And if you're a business owner, you'd expect things to be pretty stable, right?
Yeah, you'd think. What about bankruptcies? Did they spike?
They plummeted. The number of businesses going bankrupt fell steadily from 1919 right down to its lowest point in 1923 during the peak chaos.
So jobs up, output up, bankruptcies down. To an outsider, or maybe a politician wanting good news.
The evidence looked clear. The economy's booming. Inflation works. But Graham saw through it. He knew this prosperity was, as he put it, fundamentally counterfeit.
Counterfeit?
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't built on real value creation, was it? It was built on, well, injustice.
Systemic injustice. It completely destroyed the link between work, saving, and reward.
How did that work? What was the mechanism?
It was a massive forced transfer of wealth. not through fair exchange, but through the mechanics of inflation itself. The key was the price lag.
Price lag. Explain that.
Basically, different prices move at different speeds. Crucially, wages and the value of old debts lagged far behind the rapidly rising prices of goods and assets. This allowed industry to profit enormously, but at whose expense?
At the expense of creditors and workers.
Precisely. Let's take the creditors first, who lost everything.
Savers. People on fixed income.
Yes, the prudent middle class. Anyone holding bonds, mortgages, life insurance policies, savings accounts, they were utterly wiped out.
Graham gives that chilling example of the mortgage debt.
Yeah, a 40 billion mark mortgage debt from before the war, 1913. By 1923, that entire sum was worth less than a single U.S. cent.
Less than a penny. Imagine dedicating your life to paying that off or relying on that income.
It's unimaginable. The social fabric just tears apart. Graham's description is stark.
The one about creditors running away.
Yes. Creditors were seen running away from debtors, and debtors pursuing them in triumph and paying them without mercy. It captures the sheer chaos and the moral inversion.
Debtors were celebrating paying off debts with worthless money.
Exactly. Large industrial firms, landowners with old mortgages, they were suddenly debt-free in real terms. This wasn't earned capital. It was wealth transferred by monetary destruction, and that capital fueled the industrial boom.
So the debtors thrived. But what about the workers? They had jobs, but...
They were on a treadmill, running faster and faster just to stand still, and usually falling behind. Graham says they were in a constant struggle to increase wages in order merely to keep pace with the ever-renewed spurts in prices.
Always a lap or two behind, as he put it.
Always behind. Wages simply couldn't adjust quickly enough. There was this inertia. Even when unions negotiated increases, by the time the workers got the money, prices had already surged ahead again.
How do they even negotiate wages in that environment?
The time frame just collapsed. Agreements that used to last months became useless. They went down to 6 weeks. Then, by mid-1923, wage contracts were being renegotiated every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks? The stress must have been incredible.
Unbelievable. And even then, the value evaporated almost immediately.
So, for the business owner, the entrepreneur, their costs were lagging.
Dramatically. Real wages plummeted relative to the price they could sell their goods for. Interest payments on old debts became practically zero. Overhead costs calculated in old marks vanished.
While the price of their final product was soaring in nominal terms.
Exactly. That created this huge artificial profit margin. That was the engine of the apparent boom.
But Graham argues even this industrial reinvestment, this strength was also an illusion. The capital consumption mirage.
Yes, another critical insight. It looked like healthy investment, but it was often a kind of frantic decay.
How can investment be decay?
Because businesses weren't really investing for rational, long-term growth. They were desperately trying to get rid of cash that was losing value by the hour, so they bought anything tangible.
Plowing profits back into plant and equipment just to avoid holding marks.
Right. It was a hedge against currency depreciation. But the problem was twofold. First, the accounting was completely broken. With prices rising that fast, standard depreciation methods just don't work. Businesses thought they were making huge profits and reinvesting wisely, but they weren't setting aside nearly enough real value to replace their essential capital goods when they wore out, because the replacement cost in new, hyperinflated marks was astronomical.
So they were effectively eating into their own capital base without realizing it.
Yes, living off their capital, consuming it, while thinking they were growing richer.
And the second problem, the type of investments.
Because the incentive was just to spend now, regardless of long-term viability, a lot of the investment was, well, bizarre. Graham notes expenditures on equipment that was superfluous or very ill-adapted to normal, stable conditions.
Building things they didn't really need or couldn't use efficiently later.
Precisely. If you have 1 billion marks today that will be worthless tomorrow, you buy some machine, any machine, even if it doesn't quite fit your production line or market needs.
And this explains why, after stabilization finally came in 1924, there was this perception of sudden shortage of working capital.
Exactly. The boom capital had been misallocated or effectively consumed. It wasn't real productive capital ready for a stable economy.
So the roaring factories, the full employment, it was all a terrible lie, paid for by wiping out savers and squeezing workers, and ultimately by consuming the nation's real capital stock.
That's Graham's devastating conclusion. Inflation creates frantic activity, yes, but without real productivity. It's motion without progress. It substitutes speculation for sound business, rewards debtors, punishes savers, and fundamentally breaks the trust that holds an economy together.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of the final collapse. Graham had to untangle how the sheer volume of money, which ultimately drives prices, interacted with the foreign exchange rate. This sounds tricky.
It is highly technical, but absolutely crucial for understanding the dynamics. Graham makes a key distinction. While the amount of money circulating is the ultimate determinant of the price level,
Okay.
the exchange rate is influenced by many things, including psychology, expectations, international confidence. It's more complex.
And for a lot of the inflation period, these two things were out of sync.
Yes. For a long time, the external purchasing power of the mark, what it could buy abroad via the exchange rate, fell much faster and further than its internal purchasing power, what it could buy at home.
Explain that gap. What did it mean practically?
It meant if you were, say, a German manufacturer, your costs inside Germany, wages, local supplies, were rising, but not nearly as fast as the mark was falling on the foreign exchange market.
So if you sold your goods abroad for dollars or pounds?
You could convert those stable foreign currencies back into a huge pile of marks, easily covering your still lagging domestic costs and making a massive nominal profit.
Which made German goods incredibly cheap for foreigners.
A bargain counter, as Graham called it. It fueled exports, yes, but it was effectively selling off the nation's real output at fire sale prices.
Okay, so early on, domestic prices lagged behind the exchange rate collapse. But you said that changed in 1923.
It did. By 1923, that lag disappeared. Internal prices caught up and started moving almost in lockstep with the exchange rate's plunge.
What caused that?
The sheer expansion of the monetary base, particularly fueled by an explosion in private borrowing facilitated by the Reichsbank, the dam basically broke.
And this leads us to the concept of monetary velocity, how fast money changes hands.
Exactly. As confidence collapses, nobody wants to hold cash for a second longer than necessary. People spend it instantly.
We've all heard the stories, wheelbarrows full of cash, wages paid twice a day.
That's the human reaction driving velocity up. People were in a frenzy to convert money into anything real before it lost more value. Graham argues that velocity eventually hit a physical ceiling.
A physical ceiling? What does that mean?
There's only so fast people can physically handle, count, and exchange currency notes. Transactions take time. The system reached its absolute limit. Even though the gold value of all the marks in circulation was plummeting, the speed at which those marks could move couldn't increase any further.
And Graham had some incredible details about the resulting currency shortages.
He did. The most acute shortages of physical banknotes happened in late 1922 and then again, even worse, in the summer of 1923. This wasn't because there wasn't enough value, but because the notes couldn't circulate fast enough to meet the demand for transactions at those inflated prices.
And he calculated how much cash was needed just for daily wages.
Yes, it's astonishing. At certain points, paying the daily wage bill for all German workers required something like 1/8 of the entire physical money supply in circulation.
1/8. Just for one day's wages.
Yes. Think what that implies about velocity. Every single mark note had to be received as wages, spent almost immediately, make its way back to the banks or businesses, and be ready to be paid out again almost instantly.
People had hit the absolute maximum speed for spending.
There was no more give in the system. The band of monetary elasticity, as Graham put it, had been stretched till it would stretch no more.
So what happens if the printing presses physically can't keep up with that maximum velocity, if they can't print enough notes fast enough?
Then you risk a sudden, sharp fall in prices, paradoxically. A monetary collapse because the means of payment literally can't keep up with the necessary speed of transactions. The Reichsbank was in a desperate race against time and physics.
You mentioned earlier that government deficits were the main driver initially, but then private credit took over.
Yes, this is a really important shift Graham identifies. Until about mid-1922, it was mostly the government borrowing from the Reichsbank to cover its spending and reparations. But then the Reichsbank started making it incredibly easy for private banks and businesses to borrow directly from it, mainly by rediscounting commercial bills at very favorable rates.
Rediscounting. So banks lend to businesses, then take that debt to the Reichsbank and get cash for it.
Essentially, yes. And the Reichsbank was doing this very liberally. This meant the total volume of money wasn't just driven by government deficits anymore. It could expand almost infinitely based on private demand for credit.
But why would businesses want to borrow so much if inflation was rampant? Wouldn't interest rates be sky high?
But that's the key. The nominal interest rates, the stated percentages, were never raised anywhere near enough to match the rate of inflation.
So the real interest rate was negative.
Massively negative. Let's say you borrow 1,000,000 marks today at, 90% annual interest, which sounds high. But if inflation is running at 1,000% or more, you borrow that million, buy real assets like raw materials or equipment.
And by the time you have to pay the loan back, maybe a few weeks or months later,
the 1,000,000 marks plus interest you repay is worth a tiny fraction of the real value you originally borrowed. You've made a huge profit just by borrowing and holding real things instead of cash.
so there was a massive incentive to borrow and zero incentive to save or lend.
Precisely. It actively rewarded taking on debt and punished holding money. This Reichsbank policy towards private credit basically threw fuel on the hyperinflationary fire, ensuring it spun completely out of control.
And then there was one final mechanism Graham pointed to, the way international trade was invoiced.
Yes, this is a subtle but powerful accelerator he identified. It has to do with which currency was used for imports versus exports.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Think about Germany's situation, which Graham models as his case too. 1. Reparations are fixed in foreign currency, like dollars. 2. A lot of essential imports were also priced and paid for in foreign currency. But 3. A significant chunk of German exports were still being invoiced and paid for in marks.
So foreigners paid for German goods using the falling mark. Why is that so bad?
Because it creates an automatic downward spiral. Imagine the mark exchange rate falls by, say, 20% overnight. For those exports priced in marks, Germany now receives 20% fewer dollars or pounds when those marks are converted by the central bank. The dollar value of their export earnings just dropped.
I see. Less foreign currency coming in.
Exactly. But at the same time, the mark cost of paying for imports priced in dollars and the mark cost of buying dollars for reparations just jumped by 25%, the inverse of the 20% drop.
So export earnings fall in real terms, while import and reparation costs soar in nominal mark terms.
Precisely. Any fall in the mark's exchange value automatically worsened the underlying deficit, which then required printing even more marks, which caused a further fall in the exchange rate. It became self-inflammatory.
Wow. It just fed on itself until the whole thing imploded.
Until either foreign buyers were so attracted by the absurdly cheap mark prices that demand surged, or, as actually happened, confidence just completely evaporated and the system broke down.
Now we have to confront what might be Graham's most startling and maybe uncomfortable finding, the national balance sheet.
Yes, his calculation of Germany's overall material gain or loss from the entire episode.
And he concludes that, strictly in material terms, Germany as a nation actually profited from the hyperinflation. That sounds completely wrong given the devastation.
It sounds horrifyingly counterintuitive, I agree, but it's based on his cold, hard accounting of cross-border flows, stripping out the internal social catastrophe for a moment.
Okay, how did Germany supposedly profit?
Primarily through the massive unwitting gift from foreigners who bought German currency and mark-denominated assets.
You mean foreigners speculating, hoping the mark would recover?
Exactly. They bought huge amounts of paper marks, mark bank balances, German bonds. They paid for these with their own stable currencies, dollars, pounds, francs, guilders. But when Germany finally stabilized the currency in 1924, it did so at a rate of 1 trillion old paper marks to 1 new Rentenmark, which was equivalent to 1 pre-war gold mark.
1 trillion to 1.
Meaning all those paper marks and mark bonds held by foreigners became instantly totally worthless. Germany received real foreign resources or currency in exchange for paper promises that were never redeemed.
It was like a giant unintentional swindle on foreign speculators.
Graham calls it a pure gift to the German economy for which nothing but implied and unredeemed promises were ever given. He calculates the total net value of this gift, this inflow from selling worthless currency abroad.
How much?
Somewhere in the range of 15 to 17 billion gold marks for the entire war and post-war inflation period, a truly enormous sum in real terms back then.
15 to 17 billion gold marks gained just from foreigners buying worthless paper. Wow.
It's a staggering figure, but of course that wasn't the only international effect.
Right, there was the other side, the bargain counter effect you mentioned earlier. Germany selling its real goods too cheaply.
Exactly. That was the major loss on the national balance sheet. Because the mark's external value was so depressed compared to its internal value, German exports, coal, chemicals, machinery were sold abroad for far less foreign currency than they were arguably worth in real resource terms.
So they were giving away too much real stuff for too little foreign cash.
Yes. Graham estimates this total loss, the depredations upon German foreign trade from selling goods too cheaply over the 5 years, 1919-1923, was roughly 10 billion gold marks.
Okay, let's put those two figures together. A gain of 15 to 17 billion from selling worthless currency, minus a loss of 10 billion from selling real goods too cheap.
The net result on a purely material national balance sheet is a profit for Germany of somewhere between 5 and 7 billion gold marks.
So Graham's stark conclusion holds. Materially, as a nation looking purely at the inflow versus outflow of real value across borders, Germany profited from the collapse of its currency.
It's an unavoidable conclusion from his specific accounting method. Politically uncomfortable, certainly, but that's what the numbers showed regarding the net international transfer of real resources.
But focusing only on that material balance sheet feels so wrong. So misleading. It completely ignores the real damage, doesn't it? The internal destruction.
Utterly. And Graham knew this. This is where he pivots back from the cold accounting to the devastating qualitative reality. That material gain was meaningless compared to the long-term damage done within Germany.
Like the misallocated capital we discussed. The boom investments.
Exactly. All that investment fueled by negative real interest rates and the flight from cash, much of it had, quote, no prospect of showing a long-run profit.
Billions invested in the wrong things, essentially.
Yes. He says much of the equipment installed was superfluous or very ill-adapted to stable economic conditions. What happened to it after stabilization in 1924?
It had to be scrapped.
A lot of it was scrapped during the so-called rationalization period. The apparent growth during inflation was, in reality, accelerated decay and malinvestment on a grand scale, turning potentially useful capital into junk.
And then there are the costs you just can't put a number on.
The truly profound costs, the psychological scars, the social disintegration, the utter destruction of thrift and trust.
The annihilation of the middle class's savings and security.
Which is the bedrock of social stability in many ways. Graham notes that people stop seeing inflation as just chaotic, like a blind god playing capriciously. By the end, they saw it as a malevolent deity bent on smashing everything.
That really captures the shift from economic problem to existential terror.
It does. The moral fabric was shredded, honesty was punished, speculation and connections were rewarded, the prudent saver lost everything, the indebted industrialist or speculator thrived.
So when the music finally stopped in 1924, when the new stable Rentenmark was introduced, that illusion of prosperity just evaporated.
Instantly. The frantic activity ceased. The economy lurched into a sharp, painful depression, although relatively short-lived initially.
Why a sudden stop?
Because the entire boom had been fueled by the distortions of inflation, the negative real interest rates, the flight from currency, the destruction of old contracts. Once you had sound money, all the underlying weaknesses were laid bare. The misallocated capital, the lack of genuine savings, the broken balance sheets, the counterfeit prosperity vanished, revealing the real economic damage underneath.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Frank Graham's work on Weimar Germany, it leaves us with this really powerful central insight, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That the apparent economic vitality during the hyperinflation was utterly fake. It was counterfeit prosperity.
All that activity, the jobs, the factory output, it wasn't real productive growth. It was just churn, fueled by destroying savings and breaking contracts.
Motion without progress, as we said earlier. And Graham's study stands as this timeless, empirical warning about what happens when monetary policy becomes completely unmoored from reality.
That gain Germany made on the national balance sheet, the 5-7 billion gold marks. It was essentially, as Graham implied, a swindle.
It required foreigners to believe, foolishly, that a piece of paper, a mark, represented some stable claim on German wealth, even as the government was printing trillions of them. It relied on delusion.
And it underscores that core truth. Inflation isn't recovery. It's fundamentally a form of corruption, maybe disguised initially as growth.
It breaks that essential moral link between effort, thrift, and reward. It flips morality on its head, rewarding debt and speculation, punishing prudence and production.
This resonates strongly with the thinking of the American founders. They had lived through their own paper money disaster under the Continental Congress.
They had indeed. They saw firsthand how inflation enriched speculators, impoverished workers, and destroyed faith in government and law itself.
Which is precisely why they put constraints on money creation in the Constitution, like forbidding states from making anything but gold and silver legal tender for debts. They saw honest money as vital for liberty.
They understood that debasing the currency wasn't just bad economics, it was, in a sense, a political sin. It undermined the very foundations of a free republic based on contract and trust. Graham's findings are a brutal affirmation of that principle.
So the timeless takeaway here seems pretty clear.
I think so. Inflation is not growth. It's decay disguised as activity. And a free nation, a stable society, really cannot survive when its very unit of account, its currency, becomes a lie.
Honest money isn't just some technical economic preference. It seems to be a moral necessity.
And that leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Graham's study and the founders' insights point to a fundamental relationship. A government that can arbitrarily control money can ultimately control its people.
Whereas the people who demand sound, honest money can maintain control over their government. Hyperinflation is the terrifying endpoint when that relationship is reversed, when confidence in the state's handling of the basic unit of value is utterly destroyed.
A nation can always print more pieces of paper, but it cannot print wealth. It cannot print confidence. And it certainly cannot print virtue or trust.
The choice, ultimately, seems to lie between sound currency and the preservation of political and economic freedom. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.